Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you for coming back. Just a little recap. Last week, we went a little bit through the book of Genesis, but specifically we looked at Genesis 9 and 10, where we looked at Noah's blessings and curses upon his three sons, specifically the curse that he levied on Ham's son Canaan. And then we looked at the fulfillment of that curse starting to take shape in Genesis chapter 12, where Shem's ancestor Abraham is promised Canaanite land as the promised land. And Brother Jim Sullivan brought up a great point to me at the end of the meeting last week.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Brother Jim Sullivan? No. We were sitting down and he said, "Do you know what the word Canaan means?" And I didn't. And it happens to mean humiliated, or to be humiliated. And how appropriate, because as Noah was humiliated by Ham/Canaan, so will Canaan be humiliated in the future by Shem's descendants. So that was a great point by Brother Jim, and I thank him for mentioning that to me. So that's where we left off. We were in Genesis 12, where Abraham is told to leave Ur. He goes to Haran. He's told to leave there. And he gets to the land of Canaan, where God promises him the land. So that's where we left off last week. So this week, we're going to start with a short account in Genesis 12, where we're first really introduced to this land of Egypt. And as I mentioned in our first class, when I think of Egypt, I think of Jim Boyko, because his lookalike, Brandon Fraser, does the Mummy movies. And a lot of the settings are in Egypt. And when you think of Egypt, these are probably two of the most symbolic things you think of, the pyramids and the Great Sphinx. And truthfully, Brother Rich is here, so I'm a little more nervous because I'm not an Egyptologist. I don't know a lot about Egypt, except from what I've learned by doing these studies. So Rich, if I misspeak, you're more than free to correct me.
Just do what I do, make stuff up.
Make stuff up? And hope you guys don't know. But, all right.
I'm a good teacher.
I like it. Thanks, Rich. Good advice. So, and I put a quote down here from Hosea 11. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. And that is the case. This verse is fulfilled, as we know, in Matthew 2, where Jesus as a child is taken down to Egypt. You know, when Herod wants to kill the young boys, and Jesus is taken into Egypt and he's called back out of there. But there are also many other instances in the Bible where the Jews go to Egypt for one reason or another, and we'll look at some of those. My intent today is to look at a couple of instances where they're called to Egypt, to look at Egypt itself, because the background of that nation is very important for us to understand in context. Remember what we brought out last week. Egypt was a well-established nation by the time Abraham was called. So that plays a big role. It's like Egypt's just starting out. I mean, Israel is just starting out as an infant. And they're surrounded by this great nation, Egypt, to the west. And on the east, we mentioned that they were surrounded by Mesopotamia, the Assyrians, those other nations that had been well established already. So we'll look at that. Our third class, final class, actually will be in 2 weeks, as we have first principles, and then Brother Peter Davis is giving a special class, and then we'll finish up the beginning of March. But in that last class, we'll look quickly at the 10 plagues, and then we're going to look at some prophecy, where Egypt's mentioned in Scripture, prophecy-wise. So that's the plan of attack. Okay? So the land of Egypt, and it's very interesting. And I didn't know this. I guess I could have guessed it if someone asked me. But Egypt is probably the second most mentioned nation in the Bible after the land of Canaan or Israel. It's the second most mentioned, and it's mentioned almost 700 times in the Old Testament. All right? And it's also mentioned, I think it's 25 times in the New. So it's mentioned quite a bit. So it plays quite a role in the forming of God's nation, God's people. And as I already said, in biblical times, Egypt was already established. The pyramids were thousands of years old, and Israel was a newcomer onto the scene. Egypt was a transformer of cultures, and this is very important for us to remember. So many times when we read, okay, they went down to Egypt, they went here, they went there. Egypt is a well-established, and it was a pretty prosperous culture for a long time. And a lot of cultures or peoples that came in contact with Egypt transformed their way of thinking to the Egyptians' way of thinking. Their cultures were transformed to be more like the Egyptians because they saw the successes, they saw the riches of the land. Well, we have that today, don't we? People that come from other nations come to America, and they're transformed by our culture. I mean, you think of 40, 50 years ago, going to Japan, so to speak. And look at the change that's happened over in some of these other countries where they've taken a lot of our culture, and some of it not good, you know, the fast food restaurants. Kentucky Fried Chickens, when you fly into, where was it, in Jamaica? Or the first thing we saw was a Kentucky Fried Chicken. You know, we didn't expect to see that, but they've become somewhat Americanized. Well, people that would go into Egypt would become, I don't know what the word would be, Egyptianized. You know, they would really take on their cultures and their beliefs, and it would transform them. That's important for us to remember when we think of God's people going into Egypt. Because, you know, how easy could it be for them, like it is for us, can be for us sometimes, to get caught up in, wow, this isn't a bad place. You know? I'm doing well here. I've got my livestock, my grain. We're living pretty, you know, the fat of the land. And it could transform you to, you know, not think as much of what God's plans are and to think of this is pretty good the way I got it. So that's important to remember as we look at some of these accounts. Okay? In Scripture, Egypt, it's kind of a funny relationship between Egypt and God's people. Yeah, we remember the oppression of the 400 years enslaved in Egypt, and that's probably what most people think of. But there are some accounts also where Egypt is used as a place of refuge, a place where God's people can go from trouble to safety for a while. And we saw that with Jesus, you know, when he went down to Egypt. You know, so it's kind of a mixture of things. One thing you're going to see, too, in the last point, is Egypt mainly is mentioned as a place. There aren't many people from Egypt mentioned in the Bible. I think there are a few pharaohs mentioned by name, but for the most part, they're just called Pharaoh. Right? We're not told exactly who they are. And there aren't many people. Hagar is an Egyptian handmaid. She's mentioned by name because she plays a role in the story. But there aren't many people mentioned by name from Egypt. So it's more of a place. It's more of a symbol of what it stands for. You know, in some cases it's repression. Some places it's a place of refuge. Later on in Revelation, it can mean worldly, well, like Babylon is used as a worldly symbol. So that's mainly how it's used in the Bible, as that type of symbol, or is just a place. All right? And there's many reasons for that, and hopefully we'll get into some of that as well. So I want to quickly look at Abraham and Sarah's visit into Egypt, and it's found in Genesis 12. So if you could turn to that. And here we're going to see that Egypt would provide a place of refuge and a testing for both of them. Okay? So this happens, and I don't know how much time had elapsed since God had told Abram that he would inherit the land of Canaan in chapter 12. That takes place in verses 6 and 7. And then we're told that Abraham removes and goes to Bethel. And then in verse 9, we're told that he journeyed going on still toward the south. And I got in my Bible a short margin that says, traveling by easy stages. So to me, that means there wasn't a lot of stress on him. It's like they were taking a day trip. That's how I kind of think of it. You know, scouting out the land, taking a look at things. Okay? But then all of a sudden, so he's told he's going to inherit this land. He's traveling, it seems, pretty freely and easily through it. And then all of a sudden, in verse 10, there was a famine in the land. And it just says, Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. Does anyone notice anything different about that verse compared to some of the other verses where we're told Abraham is traveling? And this didn't stick out to me right away, but the little difference is, in the other verses, it says God told Abraham to get up and go. It doesn't say that here. It just says Abraham got up and went. Now, I would think that the Bible consistently, if Abraham had been told, it would have said that God had told Abraham, get up, go to Egypt because of the famine, but it doesn't say that. So I'm going to assume that God didn't tell him to go to Abraham, because God had promised him this land, right? And we know that God can take care of his people. And he shows that consistently through the Bible. So Abraham got up and went on his own. Why? Well, a famine. He was fearful. They wouldn't have food. He wouldn't be able to take care of, Sarah and those with him. So fear, I think, took him into the land of Egypt. And Egypt was the perfect place to go. If he was traveling south from Bethel, he wasn't that far away. And Egypt was, and we're going to see this a little bit when we look at Egypt, was at this time, very fertile land. There was plenty of food in Egypt. So he went to the obvious place. All right? If there was a famine here in New England and New York had corn and grain and everything goes, well, as much as I despise New York, I'm just kidding. I would go to New York, take my family to New York. He went to the obvious place. He went to Egypt. Okay? And another thing happened. So he's fearful because of the famine. He goes down to Egypt. And then he's fearful for something else. As he approaches Egypt, he realizes, my wife is beautiful. And we could have problems. Because the Egyptians loved beauty. They loved beautiful things, especially, the advisors and Pharaoh. And they're going to take my wife. And Pharaoh's going to probably try to add him to his harem, make her his. So he was fearful of that too. And again, we don't read. Maybe he did pray unto the Lord but it just says he made a decision. And he told Sarah, please tell them that you're my sister. And she obeys, and she does that. And we know this account, so I'm really rehashing something you already know. But something that I never knew was, we remember they were in Haran, and there was a nation of people called the Hurrians, and I don't think I mentioned it here. Maybe I did. That lived controlled that area. And they had many customs that seem to have influenced Abraham and some of his descendants. And again, these are just some that I found in my study. One of their unique customs was the practice of adopting a wife as one's sister. So people are saying, this could be one of the reasons why Abraham felt justified in saying that she was my sister, is that he adopted Sarah as his sister, and this was used for property and marriage law reasons, that he was able to do this. Okay? And we know in Genesis 20, he uses the same reasoning again, that she is my sister. Another one, and this is a different one when we think of Rebekah stealing the house gods. Another one was that property ownership was held by family clans, and the household gods, they were leased out to family members for use when they thought they needed them, and control of the gods was family property and was held by the senior father. And we see that why this story of the stealing of the household gods comes up later on. Jacob's stealing of Esau's birthright can be led back to Hurrian customs of passing down the household gods to the eldest son. So these could be some of these customs that were passed down to Abraham and his line. Okay? With the dual status of wife and sister, Sarah, this would give her special legal and social protections and opportunities that weren't generally offered in that part of the world to women. Another reason it could be possible, and this one I thought was strange, but the Bible scholars said it's a possibility, even though I don't think it is, that Terah adopted Sarah just before the marriage to Abraham as his daughter. There are tablets called the Nuzi tablets. Rich, have you ever heard of those?
I have, yes.
You have, that say that this was a custom of those people.
It has a lot of rules and regulations and laws
Yeah.
around this. They found a lot of different tablets in that area.
Right.
And the thing that saved them was that they were all burnt,
Yep.
and so they hardened. The clay tablets that they were, so
Yep.
they were burnt in some kind of fire, but they were protected because it turned to like a hard clay and survived for 2,000 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they found a lot of that stuff too. They found the library of Sennacherib,
Yep.
generally area with just a wealth of information on these tablets.
Wow. Well, one of the things they found on these tablets was the practice of the future father-in-law adopting his future daughter-in-law as his own. And thus that would justify Abraham saying, she is my sister. If we look at the account in Genesis 20, verse 12, Abraham clearly states that she is the daughter of my father, but not of my mother, which seems to tell us that Terah had another wife, remarried, and that she was the daughter from that marriage. But I thought it was very interesting stuff, and that could probably be a study of itself on those tablets. It's very interesting. Thank you, Rich.
One thing.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that's always interested me, and it's a question. Why did Abraham think that was going to solve the problem? Like, wouldn't it kind of open the door to Pharaoh? It's like, hey, here's my sister. She's not married.
Right.
And Pharaoh looks at this beautiful woman and say, oh, she's not married. Well,
Right.
Come on into my palace. And so he's stuck in the same position as he would be, except I guess his life would have been spared. Because I think it was part of that. Like, he was afraid of getting killed by Pharaoh.
Correct.
To take his wife. So it was a way, I think, of preserving his own life in his mind.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we see, faithful Abraham at that time with a little bit, I don't want to say a lack of faith, but he really does at that time,
Yeah.
right?
It's like a panic decision.
A panic decision without turning to God, all right? And then we see Sarah being faithful, it seems, throughout to her husband,
Yes.
to what was to happen. But what happens in this case, I think, is a great backdrop of what's going to happen in the future. Because we read, and I went through it kind of quickly, but who intervenes? God does. God intervenes in his son's, I'll call him his son Abraham's, life. He takes care of Pharaoh with plagues before Pharaoh can do anything with Sarah, really. And he has them leave the land of Egypt. And two things that amaze me. One is Sarah's. You're going to remember, when you're brought into Pharaoh's harem, some people want to call that a term of enslavement, that she was enslaved like the nation of Israel would be sometime later when they go back to Egypt. Okay. But what else happens to Sarah when she's part of a harem? Isn't she lavished with perfumes and makeup and probably living in a nice part of Pharaoh's, right? I would assume. So she really is thrust a whole bunch of Egypt at her. Well, wouldn't part of the reasoning for maybe is that, wow, this is kind of nice. I'm being made up all the time. I look great. I'm being taken care of. And then here's Abraham, and what happens to Abraham? When he leaves Egypt, when Pharaoh takes Sarah to be his own, he gives Abraham stuff, livestock. He's given possessions. Abraham must have thought that was pretty cool. Part of them, yeah, Sarah's, but he's got all this stuff now. So they leave there with God intervention, which is a foretelling of what's going to happen in the future. They come out with possessions, which for beginning any family, you really need to start somewhere. So God not only removes them from that situation, but he provides for them at the same time to start their beginning. So it's a very fascinating, and you could do classes just on that. But I think the reason I brought this out was the first time into Egypt, they came out with possessions. Sarah really steps out, and there's some thought that say that Pharaoh's priest told him that she was really Abraham's wife, or that Sarah herself might have been called into Pharaoh, and she finally said, "Look, he's my husband, not my brother." So that I guess is up for a little debate, but Sarah stands by her husband, is faithful. They come out with possessions, and probably the biggest part is God's intervention. Already in the land of Egypt, for the first time that we read of, he intervenes. Okay, any other thoughts on that before we move on? And then we move, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on when Jacob moves his family down into Egypt. We all know the accounts, okay? And this could be 3 or 4 weeks of classes on their own in the 13 or 14 chapters at the end of Genesis that cover it. But an important part I wanted to make was in Genesis 37. The story of Joseph. The favored son. In chapter 37, he receives the coat of many colors from his father. We read of the trials he faced with his brothers. You can just picture the times his brothers would pick on him, and probably like today. I remember with my 2 younger brothers, I like to beat them up. Especially the youngest Stephen, because he was Mom's favorite, and I wasn't, but Stephen was. And anytime I could get Stephen alone, if he crossed me, it was, in a loving way. We weren't overly violent, but you can see that just in that little example of the times I'd like to, put him in a headlock and give him a little nookie on the side of the head.
Gordon, are you hearing all this?
Oh, he knew. He knew. He encouraged it.
You dog world over there.
Those were the old days, Rich, when the kids used to go outside all the time and weren't home and would play out. Yeah, so they never saw anything. But from the readings, it must have been really tough on Joseph growing up, right? I mean, the favorite child, and then his brothers always looking at ways to get him. So going to Egypt for Joseph really was a place for him to prove himself, I think. To prove to himself that, I know I was a favored child, and I got a lot of things from my dad, but I can go there and I can make my own mark. So that's one thing it was for him. And for another, it was a place to get away from his brothers, wasn't it? And we know all the stories, how they sold him to the Midianites, and then he was sold into Egypt. So Egypt, again, is used individually for Joseph for that purpose, a place of refuge. And as much as he grew and became rich, we read at one point, he's second in command. And we see the stories with Potiphar, how she threw herself at him and how easy it would have been for her to take her. But deep down inside, he still remembered his upbringing. And he remembered his God, and he remembered his people. So even though he lived within this world of Egypt, that faith and that trust in God still stayed with him. And that's a lesson for us too, with everything we're surrounded with in this world. Our Egypt. How easy it can be for us to get pulled away. And it had to be that way for Joseph as well. And I just put down some of the highlights by the chapters of this wonderful story of a family who definitely had their ups and downs, as we all know. And they all had their issues. The key points we finally, in Genesis 46, Jacob moves his family down into Egypt because there was grain in Egypt, another famine in the promised land, and they go down to Egypt because there's corn and there's grain. And he meets Pharaoh. Jacob meets Pharaoh. And that's where we read where he blesses Joseph's sons. He prophesies to his sons. Jacob dies. Joseph asked Pharaoh if he can go back to Canaan to bury his father. And Pharaoh says, yes, you can go. And he goes, and then Jacob returns to Egypt, and Jacob dies in Egypt. So I don't want to spend a lot of time there, but I want to set the scene, and you can see on the map, the obvious place to go, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, was the land of Goshen, and that's where they end up, in the land of Goshen, which would provide their refuge from the famine. Would also provide the place where they are severely tested and enslaved for quite a while. All right? Any questions? Again, I know I went over it quickly, but I didn't want to spend, 2 or 3 classes talking about Jacob moving down to Egypt. I want to get to Egypt. All right? All right. So this is just a quick timeline on ancient Egypt. And as I said, they got a good head start. Most historians believe that their timeline starts around 3900 BC, where culture really starts to take shape. And we have a lot of different, and we're not going to go over all these errors. The key ones for us are the Old Kingdom, not really the Old Kingdom, I'm sorry, but to go over the Old Kingdom, that's when Egypt really started revving up. They were prosperous, they were growing, hieroglyphics started to come into play, the pyramids were built, and that's when Pharaoh really became ruler with absolute power over the people, over everything in Egypt. The Middle Kingdom, these are the 2 periods of time we want to, that really affect the time of the Bible, when we read the accounts of Israel starting to begin as a nation, as a people, are during the late Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom era. Okay? And there were difficult times during the Middle Kingdom era. There were famines and invasions from other people. And what they started to do is they started building fortresses. Now, remember, earlier with Egypt, if you were to look at a map, and this map isn't really the best to do that, but we'll give it a shot. You'll notice some certain land features, let's say, that predominate Egypt. 1 is the surrounding of water. 2, the Nile River. And 3, they're basically surrounded by desert. Okay? Most of the population that live in Egypt, I read at this time, 97% lived along the Nile River or in the land of Goshen. All right? They didn't live out in the deserts. 97%. That's a lot. They're major cities, as you can see, in developments along the Nile River. Okay? What the deserts and the waterways and then down in this area, I heard there are quite a few big waterfalls, rougher terrain. They felt pretty well protected from attack. All right? They didn't feel vulnerable at all. They felt pretty protected by their natural surroundings. So that's why this is so important. After being invaded, they said, wait, we got to do something. So they started building forts along the Nile. Don't want to spend a lot of time about this, but they were actually conquered in 1650 by a group of people. I won't call them a nation because I don't know if they really were rich, the Hyksos. All I could find is that they were called rulers of foreign countries, and that there were people from Syria and Palestine that came sweeping down into northern Egypt and stayed there for quite a while. And a lot of their culture invaded into Egyptian way of life for a little while. That's the extent of my knowledge of it. Rich, I don't know if you know anything more than...
Yeah, so the Hyksos, they're called the Shepherd Kings.
The Shepherd Kings, I did read that too.
So, they were a hodgepodge of different people from the Turkey area and Levant, where Syria is. Kind of mysterious group of people that came down to Egypt. They had the chariot. And so
Right,
the chariot
horse-drawn
was the
chariots.
technological advance that they had, and they beat the Egyptians. There is an interesting connection in the Bible, without getting too nerdy, but
We like nerdy.
Remember when Jacob comes down into Egypt to see Joseph?
Right.
And there's a little line in there that says that shepherds were an abomination to Egypt.
Yep,
And that's why they had to be separate.
right.
So in the new kingdom, the Hyksos are going to be defeated, and because of their connection with sheep, because they were shepherd kings, and where they got their power, anyone associated with the Hyksos from that area became an abomination to
Oh.
the new kingdom Egyptians.
Yep,
And they wanted to put all of that away, like just to
Yep.
take it away from their history.
yeah,
And so that's kind of some of the cultural background to that
Oh,
statement, that they were an
good stuff.
abomination. It comes back to the Hyksos
The
being the
Hyksos.
shepherd kings.
okay, that's good stuff. Thank you. All right. You all,
You
re-
make that up.
I wish I had.
see, I know who to call on. See, that's good stuff.
You'll never know.
That's right.
Brother Jim?
I was gonna say, that probably explains partially why Joseph couldn't get away with saying, oh, you're down here to spy the land.
Mm.
Yeah,
Because it's just 12 guys, you know what I mean? And it's
Yeah.
probably because of that shepherd king group, they could say, oh, yeah, you're just down here to look, check this place out.
yeah,
Yeah.
good. Thank you both. Anything else? Any other Hyksos experts? No? How many of you have heard of them before today? Anyone? No hands, except for Rich. Oh, Nancy. Nice. Good. All right, so you learned something today, all right? The new kingdom, obviously after what happened with the Hyksos, they became very militaristic. And this is one of the prime, when we talk about Scripture, the time frames that we're getting into in the Old Testament. So Egypt started to fortify, build strong armies. Looks like they used the Hyksos chariots and horse-drawn, for their own, and said, wow, this is a great vehicle to move our men into battle with. So, you know, they were slow to adapt. From what I've read about the Egyptians, they did not like change very much. So for them to adapt, but they saw something there that could help them, and they took it as their own. Of course, we know that the Hebrews were enslaved. They defeated the Hyksos, and this is where mummification was perfected, this preparing for the afterlife. They perfected it during this era, and these are some other eras that some of them should be known to us because we read of them in the Bible, the Greek era, and of course the Romans. We read about them in the New Testament, so that shouldn't be a surprise to us as well. Okay? But enough of that.
Well, can I just make
You
one
can,
point?
Rich.
Sorry.
Don't be sorry.
So if you look like with the old kingdom, right?
Yep.
Can you just go back to
Oh,
that
sure.
last slide? I'm sorry. If you look at the old kingdom, 2700 to 2041.
Yeah, and those dates are everywhere.
No,
I mean,
right.
it depends what you look
So
at.
let's just think about this, just how ancient Egypt was and how established a civilization it was.
Yeah,
The Hebrews aren't gonna go down there until the 15,
Right.
to the new kingdom.
right,
Egypt as a culture would have been around for 1,200 years.
Right.
The pyramids would have been over
1,000
1,000
years
years
old.
old by the time that the Hebrews got
Right.
down into Egypt. So just think of that in terms of how established a civilization Egypt was
Yep.
by the time the Hebrews got
yeah,
down.
yeah. And I think it was Brother Jim last week when we talked about that. He said, you really don't consider that.
Yeah.
Didn't think of it, right, Jim? Weren't you the one who said that to me? Oh, it wasn't you? I'm giving you credit for something you didn't say. I take it back. Jim didn't say it. Rich wasn't here.
Wasn't here.
I took attendance last week. No. So we made that point last week too, Rich. It's a great point to remember that. You got newborn babes, and you got these established worlds of Egypt and Mesopotamia. We looked at Mesopotamia a little bit last week too. So that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up again. All right. So we go back, and again, I don't want to spend a lot of time. This is just helpful information. At one time, Egypt was split in between Lower and Upper Egypt. Kind of funny how Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt is on the north.
Is that just because of the direction the Nile?
The Nile River, yeah, the Nile River flows from south to north. So, yeah, exactly, Jim. So there was a king, King Menes, who around 3000, 3100 BC, unified the two nations and brought them together. Wow, didn't expect that. Wow. I didn't mean that to happen, but it did. So King Menes brought, and this looks like a handsome guy, brought the two nations together. And kind of funny, each nation at the time had their own individual crowns. but when they made it unified, you can see they adopted both colors to the new crown. And it kind of reminded me of the European Union for some reason. I don't know why. I just thought of the European Union when I thought of that. Okay? Wow, this is doing things I did not expect. All right, we talked about that. And this is just some ancient Egyptian history, the age of the pyramids. Imhotep, you probably heard of that name.
No.
No, Imhotep, a ruler, as you can see, very revered. If you watch any of those movies, the name Imhotep comes up. The national god, Amun-Ra, the sun god, and we're going to look at that a little bit when we look at the plagues. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time here. I just want to get your minds into thinking Egypt, Egyptians, ancient Egypt. And, of course, the Exodus, which we all know. And some of the pharaohs at the time, again, we won't spend a lot of time on them. Some of the names, Tutankhamun, we all heard of King Tut. In 1297 BC, and Ramses II is generally accepted. I know there's some debate, Rich would probably know, but at the time the Jews are enslaved in Egypt in their exodus, it's generally accepted that Ramses II was Pharaoh king at that time. I won't say 100%, but most of what I read, there are other thoughts out there as well. You can see, when you think of Joe, the actor, I think of him.
Charlton Heston?
No, who plays,
Yul Brynner.
yeah, Yul Brynner.
Yul Brynner.
And I picture him and that head and him in the movies. He had over 200 wives and concubines, a lot of children. He reigned a long time. His building projects were well known throughout the time. I mean, he was a builder and he loved building things to himself. You'll see a lot of buildings in Egypt are made. You'll see Ramses II all over the place. And you got to remember, the key to remember when we think of pharaohs, because in the Bible, they're not really mentioned by name, are they? All the times that Pharaoh is mentioned in Exodus, it's just Pharaoh. Why do you think that is? Do you think there's a reason? Do you think they're trying to trick us so we don't know who the Pharaoh was?
They're all the same.
They're all the same? Could it be, who said title? Didn't want to glorify Pharaoh, right? That's what I think of it, right? He's just another guy. Now he played an important role. But one thing, what did the pharaohs do above everything else? The people thought of them as gods. Thought of them as gods. So like when we talked in the beginning of Genesis, when God creates the sun and the moon, he doesn't call them the sun and the moon, and I think it's for a reason. I created the greater light and the lesser light. And I think that's going to come into play down here in Egypt because the Egyptians love their sun god. The sun god. And God didn't want his people going down to Egypt and saying, look, they got the sun god and the god of the Nile and the god of the desert and the god of all these gods. God had to prepare his people for that. So that's why the creation story, I think, is partly said that way. In the beginning, God. It's kind of, there's no sun. None of this stuff exists. It's man-made. So prepare yourself. You look like you got a question, Kathy.
No, I was just thinking, I thought the word paradise meant Pharaoh-dice, King's Garden.
Well, I know paradise, the afterlife, that's what they, hope for in the afterlife upon death, and we may get into that a little bit, is going off to paradise in a world, a place that's way better than what they're currently in. And they prepared for that their whole lives, to go to paradise, the afterlife.
I thought it was Pharaoh-dice.
Oh, it could be. I don't, you got me on that one. You got me on that one. But that's what they live for. They look forward to paradise, to the afterlife. Okay? The time we have left, and we talked about Ramses II. Well, that's one of his great monuments to self. And again, we talked about the Pharaoh. Well, I don't know why it's doing this. And there's some other famous pharaohs. We won't get into those right now, but they really, wow, that's a good slide. Okay, so ancient Egypt stood for a long time, as Rich pointed out. It was around a long time before Israel was born. And a lot of things played into that. We already talked about geography. We talked about, and we'll talk about a little about the other things, politics, their social structure, their religion, all played into the stability that helped Egypt stay around for a while. In the remaining time we have, I just want to look at the Nile River. And as you can see, I thought this was a great map because it really shows the Nile River, and you can see kind of the fertility of that area and the barrenness of everything around it and how important it was. It's called the heart and soul of Egypt. And that's important for us to remember when we read Scripture. All right? Can anyone tell me, is the Nile River specifically named in the Bible? No, it's not. It's not specifically named in the Bible. And I think one of the reasons it's called the river. The river. Well, as you can see on this map, and there are other tributaries, but the river is the Nile. It's really the only real river that they have, and it sustained everything in Egypt. Okay, it sustained everything. It overflowed its banks a couple of times a year to fertilize the ground. All right, it was their life source. All right, when you think of Egypt, beyond the pyramids and the Sphinx and the pharaohs and the mummies and all that stuff, you think of the Nile River because of its importance for food, agriculture, everything revolved around the Nile River. All right, there's a picture. I've got to get to this one. We'll skip that. There's a shot of the Nile during its annual flooding. And I feel bad for these people out in the middle of it, doing their work, doing what had to be done. And there's Brother Jack on his boat in the middle of the Nile. You can see now this is more of a present-day shot, obviously, but it's quite a beautiful area. You see in the background the mountains, the protection. Beyond that, you'd have your desert zones. So you can see people really lived right along the Nile River. And there is prophecy regarding the Nile in the Bible, and we won't go specifically yet into this, but if you go into Jeremiah and Isaiah, there are prophecies regarding the Nile. When Egypt is spoken of in the Bible, a lot of times it says, let's say in Jeremiah, the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah against the Philistines before that Pharaoh smote Gaza, thus saith the Lord, behold, waters rise up out of the north, and shall be an overflowing flood, and shall overflow the land. So when Egypt was a power, all right, the Nile is spoken of in Scripture as flooding, as being full. All right? The opposite, when the Nile is described as drying up, means at times when Egypt is either at a weak point or prophesied of being weak, of another nation moving in to afflict them. So I thought that was very interesting. Why the Nile? Because we just spoke about it. The Nile was the heart and soul of Egypt. So God is taking that heart and soul and using it in describing things that will shortly come to pass against Egypt. Things that they would know, that they would realize, that the Jews would realize about that land. Make sense? And again, in our class 2 weeks, we'll look at more of these type of prophecies about, that's, again, I was not expecting these, and we talked a lot about these, and we don't have much time left. But we can see, their prosperity was based a lot on the Nile. Trade, they had great trade routes with the river, all right? The river helped them in that aspect too. And they had to do a lot of trade, because, they didn't have trees. So they traded with Lebanon for cedar logs, cedar wood. Remind anyone of anyone? Anything in the Bible? We read of someone trading with Hiram? Solomon, yeah. Egypt was doing the same. They were trading 4 cedar wood for logs, because they just didn't have it where they were. See, these little tie-ins that you can tie in with scripture that you may not have thought of, and I think that's kind of cool. Nubia was a land down to the south, which is current Sudan, if I'm not mistaken. And Egypt set up some trade with them. And I think that's where we're going to end today. Social roles, we can get into that next time when we have our next class. Any questions or comments? Can you repeat that? So, Lord willing, we'll take a look quickly, finish this up, and we'll look at we'll look at the 10 plagues, and then we'll look at some prophecy in Isaiah and Jeremiah that speaks a little bit on Egypt. Any comments? No? We're all good? All right.